From out of the depths of my soul, there arises a certain fear. What if I should die within the next year? Life for me has just begun. All of my dreams would be unfulfilled, all my work left undone, all my goals unreached. My life would have been in vain. Those are the poetic written words of a 16-year-old girl in 1964. And just 3 days after Christmas of that year, in the quaint town of Garfield Heights, Ohio, this same girl was getting ready to meet up with friends. When her friend shows up at their agreed-upon time, she does not answer the door. Later that afternoon, the teen's father would come home to a horrific discovery: his oldest daughter dead on her bedroom floor, the victim of a vicious homicide. As detectives dig into her life, they find out from those closest to her that this girl, Beverly, had recently become a stalking victim, something they didn't even have really a word for back then. This stalker has never been identified, nor has her killer, leaving the possibility that they weren't one and the same. But believe it or not, even though the release of this episode is the week of the 60th anniversary of her disappearance, cold case detectives are still working with carefully preserved evidence, and their case is expanding. May this be the year that Beverly's case is finally solved. My name is Megan, and each week on A Simpler Time True Crime, I cover older unsolved cases and challenge the idea that a simpler time means a safer time. This week, I'm bringing to you the unsolved murder of Beverly Jarosz. Early in the morning of December 28, 1964, Eleanor and Thaddeus Jarosz left their home at 10921 Thornton Avenue in Garfield Heights, Ohio, leaving their two daughters home alone. Thaddeus, who typically went by Ted, owned his own business, the Universal Lighting and Manufacturing Company in Cleveland. Her mother worked at a place called the Gellin Company, which was a floor and tile company in Cleveland. Beverly was 16 and Carol was 12. The parents headed off to work, and the girls had plans to go over to their grandmother's house. Garfield Heights is a suburb of Cleveland. In the early 1900s, it was a mostly undeveloped area, and it was along the railroad tracks, which were apparently there was this big dispute in the area due to a place called Dead Man's Crossing. This was a place where several people were hit and killed crossing the tracks until the railroad agreed to change them after years of litigation. But the railroad company didn't actually keep their word, and so the townspeople removed the railroad tracks themselves. By 1920, the population was only about 1,500, but the appeal of a suburb south of the quote-unquote less desirable neighborhoods of South Cleveland, Garfield Heights had a ring to its name, a juxtaposition to the Cleveland Flats. Suddenly, the population really took off. Between 1920 and 1930, the population grew by a whopping 511%, and between 1950 and 1964, the population again almost doubled, and by then, 43,000 people were residing in the humble working-class suburb. Among them was the Jarosz family, and several people close to them. Their home was on a quiet street with small brick homes and was only 1 block long. It hardly got any traffic. Beverly was a high school student who was wise beyond her years. She absolutely loved the arts. She would spend her free time wandering the Cleveland Museum of Art or writing poetry. She also loved to read poetry and other literature like Shakespeare. The Jarosz home was a modest Cape Cod where you climbed a set of steep stairs up from the living room, and the upstairs was all one room. The uniquely laid out, oversized bedroom with slanted, wood-paneled ceilings was shared by Beverly and Carol. In the room was bookcase after bookcase of classics and new books alike, and the walls were covered with art and paintings curated by Beverly herself. She loved listening to classical music, and if you read articles and interviews from the time, almost everybody mentioned this about her. Just a few days prior to this date, Christmas of 1964, Beverly had received a set of Shakespeare plays and a gold-embossed notebook to write her poetry in. Beverly was well-liked but shy and was described as slow to warm up to people. She attended Marymount High, which was an all-girls Catholic school. For a part-time job, she worked at Marymount Hospital as a typist. At age 16, she had begun to think of her future, but she was at odds with it. She wanted to become a Latin teacher, but also talked to her mother about becoming a nun. On that December 28th day of 1964, we have a very good timeline of Beverly's movements, and so let me lay it out for you. At 10:30 a.m., Beverly and her sister Carol leave their residence and head to their maternal grandmother's home on Dorothy Avenue, a little over a mile away. At around 11 a.m., Beverly calls two friends from her grandmother's home, Barbara and Marge. They made plans for the afternoon to hang out and go shopping, which was a favorite pastime of Beverly's. Barbara was going to meet Beverly at her house and then walk the less than half a mile walk over to Marge's. The girls have lunch with their grandmother, Mrs. Vanek. While eating, the conversation is casual and normal, and Beverly tells her grandmother how she got a new sweater for Christmas and plans to change into it when she gets home. At around 12 noon, Beverly says goodbye to her sister and grandmother and begins the walk home alone. A neighbor of Mrs. Vanek spots Beverly and notes how cold it is outside, so she tells her 18-year-old son to give her a ride home. He does this and drops her off at around 12:10 p.m. This boy does not go inside with her. He just drops her off in the driveway and sees that she gets inside. He doesn't see anything amiss. Based on how the house is found, it's believed she walked in and placed her coat on the banister and her purse on the kitchen table. Next to her purse, she had a copy of a book she was reading titled The Heritage of Music. It is then believed she may have turned on the downstairs radio to play the classical music she so loved. Somewhere between 12:10 p.m. and 12:40 p.m., she heard from someone named Stephen Stankiewicz, a colleague of her father, asking to speak with him. She let him know that her father wasn't home, and they had a brief conversation. She then wrote a note for her father, and it read, "Stephen Stankiewicz called. We'll call back later." At 12:40 p.m., a jeweler called the home looking for Eleanor to let her know that a necklace she had taken in to be repaired was ready to be picked up. At approximately 1 p.m., Beverly called her mother at work to let her know. Beverly and Eleanor chatted for a few minutes before she said that she needed to go because she was expecting Barbara and she still needed to get changed. Little did Eleanor know at the time this would be her last conversation with her beautiful daughter. At 1:10 p.m., Beverly's grandmother, Mrs. Vanek, called back to check on Beverly, likely to make sure she made it home okay. We don't know a lot about this conversation, other than to note that Mrs. Vanek said Beverly was rushed and antsy, and that Beverly said she couldn't talk because Barbara had just arrived. The phone was located downstairs, and the thought was then that between 1:10 and 1:15 p.m., Beverly went upstairs to get changed. At 1:25 p.m., Barbara's mother dropped her off and drove away. Barbara walked to the side entrance of the Cape Cod home and found the door ajar, but the storm door locked. She noted that there were no cars in the driveway and no cars parked on the quiet street. She decided to go to the front door and knock. This door was locked too, and she got no answer. She was taken back by how loud the music was playing. It sounded like it was on full blast. She rang the doorbell, again, no answer. Barbara was honestly puzzled. She thought that maybe her friend was annoyed with her for being late. She walked over to the mailbox and grabbed a magazine to flip through while she waited for Beverly to answer. She then heard a loud thud, which she thought was maybe the sound of furniture being moved or a dresser being knocked over. Not being able to get an answer at the door, she was confused but not overly worried at that point. Again, she thought maybe there had been a mix-up or that Beverly was just frustrated because she ran late. So Barbara walked back to her home and tried calling Beverly, but nobody answered, and she tried a few more times without answer. Soon after, Marge called Barbara asking where they were. Barbara told Marge that Beverly had not answered, and the two 16-year-old girls decided at this point that something was off. Marge then called Mrs. Vanek. Barbara later recalled that when they told Mrs. Vanek that Beverly had not answered the door for her, that Mrs. Vanek exclaimed, "Oh my God, she's dead." It was as if the grandmother had already had some sense of what had happened, what some may call a premonition, much like the poetry I read from Beverly at the beginning of this episode. Clearly concerned, Mrs. Vanek called her son-in-law, Ted Jarosz, who left work early to check on his daughter. He arrived home at 4:30 p.m. Immediately from the driveway, he heard the radio on full blast and was concerned. The side door was still ajar, but Ted found the storm door to be unlocked. He entered the door and called out, "Bev." When he got no answer, he ran up the steep staircase and found what no father should ever find. There on the floor was his oldest daughter, covered in blood, face down, and mostly nude. He ran up to her to check for a pulse, and when he found none, he ran back out. Beverly Jarosz was dead, and the investigation would be the most intense one in the history of Garfield Heights. Beverly was found face down in a pool of blood. Beverly and her sister had twin-sized beds next to each other a few feet apart. Beverly was found in between the two of them. Her pants, tights, and underwear were all off, so she was nude from the waist down. She had a sweater on that had been ripped open with buttons found on the floor. Her bra and slip she had on underneath was pushed up. Garfield Heights police immediately knew they were in over their heads, and they actually called Cleveland police within minutes. Leading the investigation from Garfield Heights was William Horrigan, who would say this was, quote, "the worst killing I've ever seen." The Cuyahoga County coroner, Dr. Samuel Gerber, had actually worked on another infamous Ohio case from the 1930s. These were dubbed the Cleveland Torso Murders, and he said that Beverly's murder was, quote, "as vicious a crime as I have ever seen in my 29 years as a coroner." And let me just tell you guys, I have seen even the modern day detectives who are working this case discuss it, and they get emotional talking about it. So you can only imagine how horrible this crime scene was for all of them to have this level of dedication to needing to see it be solved. The response from law enforcement was swift and aggressive. I'll have pictures from the early days of the investigation on our Instagram, @simplertimecrimepod. Police immediately brought in scent dogs to try to track the scent of the perpetrator. They tracked the scent down the stairs, through the back door, through the yard and some bushes, and eventually lost it on the street behind the home, McCracken Road. This is consistent with Barbara's account that she did not see any cars parked in the driveway of the Jarosz home nor on the street nearby. So it's possible the killer parked on McCracken Road and that the scent was lost because he got into a car. Another thing that Ted had observed was that the back door was open and ajar, as was that storm door. Ted reported that the family never used this door and that both the door and storm door always remained locked. So just to summarize and give exact detail, because I know this is a lot of information about the doors and it's likely very relevant to the case, when Barbara arrived, the front door was locked. The side door was ajar, but the storm door was locked. She had not checked the back door. When Ted arrived home, The side door was open at a 90-degree angle and the storm door was unlocked. The back door was open at a 45-degree angle and the storm door was also unlocked there. These storm doors were not the ones that would lock automatically. You would have to pull them shut and lock them manually. One neighbor claimed that they saw a teen boy walking up the driveway around the estimated time of the murder, around 1:45 p.m. They said this person calmly got into a car parked between two others and drove off. But this would conflict with Barbara's statement. It also wouldn't align with the tracking dogs tracing the scent to the street behind the house. I couldn't find any additional information on this potential witness statement, so this is just speculation on my part, but I wonder if maybe the witness saw Barbara from a distance and thought she was a boy, or saw Barbara's mother's car when she dropped her off. I'm unsure. It is possible that this witness did see something significant, so I don't want to completely discredit it. But another thing is, whoever did this had to be covered in blood. So I just have a hard time believing that someone just calmly walked to their car and you didn't notice that they were covered in blood. Besides Barbara hearing the thumping sound and loud music when she showed up to meet her, nobody else in the neighborhood heard anything. Pivoting for a moment, I want to discuss the state of the bedroom and the findings of the autopsy and how the two relate to one another to create a picture of what might have happened. Beverly was found face down between the two twin beds. She was lying partially on a blood-soaked blanket that was typically on the foot of her bed. The autopsy revealed that Beverly died from strangulation, but that her stab wounds were also enough to have killed her as a standalone as well. The rope was cut into 3 parts that had loops on 2 parts at the end. Investigators pieced this evidence together and found that the killer was likely strangling her from behind while stabbing her, and that the knife or sharp instrument cut the rope in the frenzy of the stabbing. I will say, I don't have the evidence in front of me, so I trust the police perspective, but that did stand out as a little odd to me just because it would be quite surprising to cut a rope with a swipe of a knife and not have to go back and forth to cut the rope. Just thinking out loud. Beverly had over 40 stab wounds, and most were not through her clothing. So you'll recall that her sweater was ripped and her slip and bra pushed up, and she was nude from the waist down. The conclusion was that the stabbing occurred after she was in that state of undress. And honestly, it sounds like this was such a rushed and animalistic attack that this was probably just seconds apart. The rope used did not belong to the Jarosz family. Detectives were able to trace the manufacturing to North Carolina, though apparently this brand was widely distributed. It was typically used as a clothesline. The sharp object or knife used to stab Beverly has also never been located. It was used to stab Beverly in her chest, neck, and shoulders, and Dr. Samuel Gerber stated that it would have been very sharp and about 3 inches in length. Beverly had defensive wounds on her hands, but her nails were not broken or chipped, and she had no evidence underneath her fingernails. I was discussing this aspect with a friend because this puzzled me, and he shared the idea that maybe she was trying to punch versus scratch, and thus her hands would have been balled up into a fist versus the scratching motion, which would have gotten something under her nails or broken her nails. And I do think that's possible and a good idea of what could have happened. We do know based on all the evidence that Beverly put up a huge fight with her attacker. There was a 9-inch by 5-inch hole on the wall by her head on the slanted Cape Cod ceiling. I'll have a picture of this on the Instagram, but keep in mind that it's larger in the picture because police removed additional parts of this for evidence collection and to search for the murder weapon. There was blood on her bed near the foot and head as well as the sheets, so it's possible the attacker tried to assault her on the bed and that maybe she kicked the hole into the ceiling when she was fighting back. And then the attack spilled onto the floor. Beverly also had been slashed on her face from her left cheek down to her chin and her right cheek down to her throat. A throw rug that was normally between the 2 beds was bloodied and bunched up under Carol's bed. The nightstand was left untouched. Also, just of note, the struggle was only in the upstairs of the house. There was no sign of forced entry or any struggle on the main floor. Given everything I've told you, you may be surprised to learn that Beverly was not sexually assaulted. Investigators theorized that based on how the body was found, one of three scenarios was likely. 1, the crime was sexually motivated, but the person was unable to perform sexually that day. 2, the crime was sexually motivated, but the sex act was interrupted before it could happen. Or 3, the scene was posed to look like a sexual assault. Police collected about a dozen fingerprints and palm prints, some bloody, but all but 3 were ruled out as belonging to Beverly or her family members. Those unidentified prints remain part of the evidence in this case today. Searching the yard did not produce too much information besides the scent trail. There was a clump of hair thought to belong to Beverly found in the backyard. When they traced the path the killer likely took through the garden and bushes into the back street, they found a footprint in the dirt next to the curb, but that didn't really amount to anything. A funeral was held for Beverly just after the new year at St. Therese Church and was filled with her fellow Marymount High School classmates in a community that had been turned upside down by this tragedy. The family's home was still a crime scene and a killer was on the loose, so the Jarosz family stayed with Eleanor's family temporarily. Police interviewed so many people. By the second day, they had already interviewed over 100 friends and acquaintances of Beverly. Within the first few months, it would be over 300 people interviewed. These people also provided their own fingerprints for comparison. This process went on for all the people that they could think of, just a series of fingerprint comparison and polygraph tests and interviews. It was Beverly's acquaintances, local delivery men, the mailman, a meter reader who was working in the neighborhood. Garfield Heights actually had their own version of a sex offender registry back then, and all of those on the list were interviewed, polygraphed, and cleared. During the investigation, though, they did get an intriguing lead. After Beverly's murder made front-page news, a secretary at a primary care physician's office less than a mile from Beverly's home came forward. She said a man came into the office on the afternoon of Beverly's murder with a deep gash on his hand, looking to see a doctor. Looking at the significance of it, the secretary instructed the man to go to the hospital because she knew their office wasn't equipped for that kind of injury. This man walked out and didn't ever go to any area hospital. Police released this to the media, trying to get the man to come forward. They said he wasn't a suspect. They just wanted to discuss this with him so that they could clear him. But he didn't. Police worked with the secretary to do a drawing called an identikit, and this was like a composite sketch type technology at the time. This composite sketch was then distributed, and I'll share a picture of that on the Instagram. It's not a very detailed looking one. I feel like I could see this person at any grocery store and not think twice of it. It doesn't really have a lot of distinguishing features. So unsurprisingly, nothing further did ever come of this lead, though to me it seems pretty relevant to the case. Obviously, this person had to get some kind of medical attention, even if it was in somebody's house or from a friend, so somebody out there has to know a little something more about this. Then, investigators focused in a new direction when they learned something from Ed Jarosz. Beverly had been receiving unwanted attention, and they wondered if this secret admirer and her killer were the same person. Before we get into Ted's reports of the stalking incidents, I want to first mention something that may be connected. According to an article in the Claremont Sun, a year prior to her murder, a guard working at the Cleveland Museum of Art reported seeing a man following Beverly around the museum. Beverly frequented the museum, so the guard was familiar with her, and he kept an eye on the situation because it was giving him a funny feeling. He described the man as looking angry and said he was tall and thin. I couldn't find exact reporting on when the guard came forward, so I'm not sure if he warned Beverly at the time or if he shared this experience after learning about her death in the papers. Ted Jarosz stated that Beverly had been receiving numerous hang-up calls in the months leading up to her death. The caller would call the Jarosz family on the party line and then just linger on the line before hanging up, never saying anything. At times, these were occurring up to 12 times a day. The final time this happened was in early December, just weeks before the attack. 6 months earlier, in July of 1964, Beverly found a package in the mailbox that said "To Bev" on it. Inside was a silver bracelet and ring. It had been purchased at a major department store and gift wrapped. There was no note about who left it. Uncomfortable by this, Beverly refused to wear the jewelry. Then, a month later in August, a package showed up on the back deck. It also said "To Bev," and this time it was inexpensive costume jewelry. Again, creeped out, Beverly refused to wear this jewelry. One night when Carol and Ted arrived home, they caught a man standing on the sidewalk staring up into the girl's bedroom. Ted chased the man down the sidewalk, but he got away. Beverly's family said at this point she began to be very fearful. She would always have the blinds closed. She was double-checking locks, and if she was ever out somewhere, she'd frequently check in with her family. Everyone who knew Beverly said that she would never open the door to a stranger or have let someone strange into the home when she was home alone. The stalker theory was intriguing and opened up a whole new thought process. Had this person been watching her for months, planning when he could strike and fulfill his fantasy? Was he enraged that Beverly did not accept his gifts and was not flattered by them, and this sent him into some sort of rage? One final thing to note for now with the stalker theory is this. Remember that phone call Beverly took down for her father on the day of her murder from his coworker? Her dad and family reported that they didn't know anybody by this name. It's widely speculated that this could have been the killer or her stalker calling, getting a sense of if Beverly was home alone that day. Given everything we now know, I want to go into the top people who were looked into for this case as potential suspects. Because they have never been accused of any crimes, I'm only going to use their first name. Police interviewed Beverly's current boyfriend, Roger. He was a college student at Western Reserve and was described as a straight-laced conservative Catholic who attended Latin Mass and opposed changes to the Catholic Church implemented by Vatican II. People stated that Roger treated Beverly well and that Beverly liked hanging out with him and his college-age friends who were all very into the intellectual scene. Beverly and Roger had hung out just the night before her murder, and witnesses described them as lovey-dovey and affectionate with each other with no fights or anything. Roger claimed to be homesick on the day of Beverly's murder, working on his car. Since Roger's car can't vouch for him, he didn't really have an alibi. His first polygraph test was inconclusive, so they gave him a second one, which he passed. But he wouldn't get ruled out. Detective Horrigan said at the time, quote, "There are some elements to Roger's present story that bother us," end quote. They next interviewed Beverly's ex-boyfriend, Daniel. He was not so straight-laced, but he was at work that day and had a time card and colleagues who vouched for him to provide an alibi. He passed a polygraph test as well. Having said that, he did apparently take the breakup hard and had done things like bring her Easter baskets and gifts and shown up to her school to try to win her back. The woman who lived next door to Daniel said he came home in a hurry on the day of Beverly's murder. Something noteworthy is that Daniel cooperated with the investigation until 2005, about a year after cold case detectives reopened it. It's possible that this is a red flag, or that he was just exhausted from being scrutinized over the years. He then eventually left the country and moved to Israel. Beverly's neighbor John was also brought in for questioning. He was around 20 years old and was said to be attracted to Beverly, but kind of shy and awkward. He once even admitted to spying on her while she was sunbathing. He did not have an alibi because he said he was home alone that day, and his polygraph was inconclusive. But police didn't have any solid evidence, so they were forced to move on. It was said that Beverly didn't know John that well and likely would not have opened the door for him since she was so nervous about opening the door for anyone at the moment. Another neighbor named Bruce was also interviewed. He was 21 years old at the time and lived directly behind Beverly at his parents' house. The Jarosz family was very familiar with him as he attended their church and sometimes gave Beverly a ride home. It was said that he had a crush on Beverly and that Beverly's friendship circle sometimes mocked this crush and would tease Beverly about Bruce having the hots for her. At one point, Beverly wrote a note to her friend Barbara that said, quote, "Bruce came over to see what I look like when I'm not dressed. I still have my blue robe on and my hair in rollers," end quote. Police found this suspicious and they interrogated Bruce, but he had a solid alibi being home with his parents. Because of this alibi, he was never given a polygraph. Bruce went on to become an art teacher, and he was alleged to engage in creepy behavior with female students, asking them to pose in bikinis. He made one assistant so uncomfortable that she quit. Bruce also distanced himself from Beverly. He told detectives that he barely knew her, which was, of course, not true. The next was a man named Harry. He was a door-to-door salesman who had moved to the area 3 months before Beverly's murder. Because of this timing, he wouldn't have been able to have been the stalker or the one to have left the gifts because that started over the summer. His main reason for being a suspect was because he was violent towards women and he lived in the area. He had attacked 3 women at knife point in the year before Beverly's murder, before moving to Garfield Heights. He had also raped his stepmother, and then he was arrested for stabbing a pregnant housewife in February of 1965. While being interrogated for that, he was questioned about Beverly's case. He actually confessed and then recanted a confession. He didn't have a solid alibi for the time of her murder, but when he mapped out how the murder took place in his alleged confession, he got details of the house layout wrong, as well as details of the crime that only the killer would have known. When Detective Horgan asked why he confessed, he said, "Because you guys were going to pin it on me anyways." Harry didn't know Beverly, and he was said to have had a creepy affect about him. He was chased out as a previous salesman in another town where he was going door to door because of his aggressive tactics. So it's highly unlikely that Beverly would have just let this man in. Some online sleuthers have suggested that perhaps her friend Barbara committed this crime. I will say that the police have publicly and loudly cleared both Barbara and Marge, so I'm not even going to dive into that one. The only thing I'll say about it is they thought the motivation was possibly jealousy or something along those lines, and they pointed to the fact that she is someone who obviously Beverly was expecting, so she would have let in, and then they were pointing to the idea that possibly the scene was set up to look like a botched sexual assault, so it was actually committed by a woman. But that's literally it, and I just don't give too much thought to that theory. Something odd did happen 7 years after Beverly's murder. The Jaros's were attending the funeral of a neighbor when their home was broken into. The only items taken were a gold watch and 2 paintings beloved to Beverly. Police and the family felt that the intruder was breaking in looking for something specific, but it's unclear if they found what they were looking for and if the person who burglarized the home was also Beverly's killer. Beverly's family understandably struggled in the wake of Beverly's brutal murder. They did eventually move back into the house after friends helped clean up the blood. Her sister Carol began sleeping in the room she used to share with Beverly, but she said she was always creeped out and it was just never the same. For high school, Carol enrolled in the Marymount Convent and contemplated becoming a nun. She never did follow through on that end and felt that her desire to take her life in that direction was out of fear of what had happened to her sister. She went on to say that her family had difficulty discussing Beverly after her murder and that her parents were very protective of her. She was never home alone again after that day until the day she got married. Ted and Eleanor eventually divorced, the pain of the loss of their daughter being too much for the couple. I mentioned this in my most recent episode, that the loss of relationships amidst a traumatic event is something not talked about enough. Sometimes different ways of grieving and healing can place too much space between two people. Ted Jarosz stayed in the family home for decades, leaving it exactly as is in case someday a person was arrested and the jury needed to come see the home. He even left the radio in its place. Detective Horrington remained obsessed with the case even into his retirement. He actually worked on the case until his death in 2004 at age 93. He had a person who he believed was his main suspect on day 2 of the investigation. So much so that it may have given him some tunnel vision. He felt he knew who did it but just couldn't prove it. Every year on the anniversary, he would call this suspect until eventually this suspect began calling him on the anniversary. It's now been widely discussed by those close to the case that this suspect that Horrington was set on was Beverly's boyfriend, Roger. However, it seems he was wrong all along. Modern-day detectives from Garfield Heights Police Department have publicly cleared him. Speaking of the modern-day detectives, the case was reopened by cold case detectives in 2004. You'll recall in 2005, that is when Beverly's ex-boyfriend Daniel stopped cooperating and fled the country. For what it's worth, Beverly's sister Carol has corresponded with Daniel over the years in writing and has said that at one point Daniel wrote her a very nice note. They also exchanged some emails after the 50th anniversary of Beverly's death in 2014. Carol gave Daniel's email address to the cold case detective who wanted Daniel to answer a few questions, but Daniel never wrote back. Carol wrote some emails pleading with Daniel just to answer the detective's questions, but he never responded to her either. Cold case detectives also circled back to her neighbor John. He got squeamish as well with talking to anybody in the midst of the fresh investigation, and he lawyered up. Police then approached John's sister at her place of work to interview her. Apparently, they wanted to ask if she helped John dispose of the murder weapon. She was interviewed for over an hour and then stopped cooperating and lawyered up. Still, current detectives have implied that they've all but cleared John as a suspect as well. I wasn't able to find any information on the modern-day probe into Bruce, if that ever happened. Some people in online sleuthing communities have drawn a comparison to another murder that happened to another young Ohio girl in the same year of Beverly's murder. On June 30th, 1964, 14-year-old Jessica Minter was found dead in her home on Anita Drive in the Lawrenceville neighborhood of Springfield, 190 miles away. Jessica also had dark brown hair and was built similar to Beverly. She was home alone and expecting a friend to stop by that day. Her mom was off at work. Despite many people being around in the neighborhood that day, the only witness was a 10-year-old boy who was playing outside. He claimed that morning that he saw a red and white boy's bike in the driveway and heard a scream come from the Minter home. A short while later, the friend showed up to meet Jessica. The friend found the door ajar, and when she peeked in, she saw Jessica in a pool of blood sprawled out on the living room floor. Jessica had been in her nightgown, and it had been pushed up, with only a couple of knife wounds going through her nightgown, and the rest were occurring directly onto her skin after the nightgown was pushed up. She had not been sexually assaulted, and there was no sign of forced entry. Police theorized that Jessica had opened the door to someone she knew, considering she was still in her nightgown, and turned around, so left her back to this person. They then thought as she turned her back, the stabbing began. She may have tried to then flee through the living room and was pushed down or collapsed. Once on the ground, her nightgown was lifted and the rest of the stabbing occurred. Jessica and Beverly were both attractive young girls who were home alone and waiting on friends when they were attacked. They both lived in similar working-class neighborhoods. Both were stabbed repeatedly, Jessica around 20 times and Beverly around 40. Neither were sexually assaulted. Both had likely let in their attacker, and both were nude from the waist down and had their shirts or nightgown pushed up. The parallels are hard to ignore, but there's never been any conclusive connections made to the cases. This was a lot of information, so let's look back on what we do know about Beverly's case. 1, we have a pretty concrete timeline of when the crime took place and her movements that day. The crime occurred likely between 1:15 and 1:30 p.m. We know Beverly had a stalker leading up to her death. We know that on the day of her death, Beverly received a call from someone who gave a pseudonym and asked information that would let them know she was home alone. We know the killer brought the murder weapons with him, implying premeditation to commit the murder. We know that Beverly was disrobed but not sexually assaulted. It is suspected that Beverly knew her killer. Her family is adamant that she would not have left any door unlocked. But knowing that Barbara was due to arrive at 1 and was running a few minutes late, is it possible that after getting off the phone with her grandma, she did just leave it unlocked, knowing Barbara would be there any second and she had to get changed? You'll remember, her grandmother said she sounded rushed on her call with her. If that theory would be true, could the killer have entered, locked the storm door behind him, then turned up the music to drown out any noise from the attack and begin the attack in her bedroom? We of course don't know, but that's a theory that has stuck with me. In 2015, Garfield Heights Police Department sought the help of the Vidocq Society. The Vidocq Society is a pro bono crime-solving organization out of Philadelphia made up of former law enforcement and FBI agents, and they only take the best of the best. They will review cases that are stumping investigators and give their insight. Vidocq reviewed the case and passed along their top suspect back to Garfield Heights. This person is, of course, not publicly named, but is referred to as a family friend. This is a person that the Vidocq Society came up with and who wasn't previously on the list of persons of interest. This person was said to have access to the Jarosz house and had been over to the house several times as a family friend. Despite her cautious nature, she would have opened the door to this person. It was said that this person did not cooperate then or now. He would not give fingerprints, submit to a polygraph, or give his DNA. He also provided an alibi for his whereabouts that day, and the alibi did not confirm his story. My sense is that Garfield Heights is now working to build a case against this person, and I'll share more about why I think that in a moment. But first, I wanted to tell you the rest of what came of Beverly's family, who are the surviving victims of this terrible tragedy. Ted died in 2012 at the age of 90, never knowing who killed his daughter and never recovering from the loss. In 2016, Beverly's sister Carol put together a book of Beverly's poetry and gifted it to her mother Eleanor. Eleanor was brought to tears. Eleanor loved this collection of poetry. Eleanor had said that as soon as Beverly turned 16 years old, Eleanor began having premonitions that something was going to happen to Beverly's body, and she couldn't shake a feeling of unease. She said this was the only premonition she's ever had in her life. Carol published this book of poetry, which you can buy a copy of. I'll link it in the show notes. It's not only her sister's poetry, but letters to Beverly from Carol and Eleanor. Eleanor's read in part, quote, "My only consolation now is that I will soon be with you. What a joyous reunion that will be." Eleanor died in 2018 at the age of 92, and I hope her reunion with her daughter was everything she was looking forward to and more. I want to end this episode with a statement from the Garfield Heights Police Department from December 16th, 2024. It reads as follows: Beverly Jarosz update. As the 60th anniversary of the Beverly Jarosz murder approaches, the Garfield Heights Police Department would like to provide an update. Beverly's case remains a top priority of the Garfield Heights Police Department and is still aggressively being investigated. Some of the recent activity has included the following: advanced MVAC DNA testing on key pieces of evidence, which has resulted in newly discovered DNA, interviews of witnesses, and surveillance. The Garfield Heights Police Department has worked closely with federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies throughout this process. Our department is grateful for their support. We have been in frequent communication with Beverly's sister Carol as new developments occur. It is our goal to give her and her family, as well as the community, the answers they deserve. The brutality of Beverly's murder still weighs heavy on our hearts, and we will never give up on seeking justice. If anyone has new information they would like to provide on the case, please contact Detective Maneri at 216-475-5686 or menary@garfieldhts.org. This has been another episode of A Simpler Time True Crime. If you appreciate the work I'm doing, please share this episode and the podcast with your friends. Word of mouth, along with 5-star reviews and social media shares, helps me to get the information out there on these cold cases. I take case suggestions to my email, simplertimecrimepod@gmail.com. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at simplertimecrimepod, where I post pictures for each case. I'm also on TikTok and Facebook. As always, thank you so much for listening.